welcome. We are happy to be in week 6, and we're learning about chapter 12 this week from our textbook, National Nations of the Great Basin. I'm showing you right now a copy of our study guide. We'll come back to it in just a minute, but first, yes, let's look at a lovely homepage for our website. It's great. So let's go back. This is our study guide. And you can always find the study guide by going to the all-in-one schedule and then clicking on the study guide. But this week, you'll notice that there's several areas that have been marked with blue. And as you probably have understand by now, the blue font, yellow highlighting are extra important little hints that might help you for the exam. Although all of the items that are listed here, different key facts, are important to learn. All right, so let's start off with the Great Basin. Why is it called the Great Basin? You may wonder. I'll tell you why. So here's a map that has the different regions for Native American nations that we have to look at. And right this week, we're going to be looking at the Great Basin here. It's called the Great Basin because the water from that lands, in occasional rains, especially during summer monsoon rains, and the snow melt that comes on this eastern side of the Sierra don't go to the Pacific Ocean. They don't go to the Gulf of Mexico. They pretty much stay in lakes here. So, of course, you've heard of the Great Salt Lake, which is right next to Salt Lake City. And there's other smaller lakes, Pyramid Lake, so on, and Lake Tahoe up in here. So this is called a basin because, like a basin in a sink, the water can't get out. And it's just refers to the geography of the place. Let's go back to so look, we just figured that out as far as where did they live, the Aboriginal people, the Native Americans in this region. Let's go back to our map again. And where most people lived, and there weren't a whole lot of people way back before the Europeans came, maybe 35, 40,000 people, something like that, that lived in all of this big area. It's because it's so dry, and most of the people lived between 5,000 and 7,000 feet of elevation. And this is because it wasn't as hot and dry, and there were some animals to eat, some different kinds of plants to eat, whereas the flatter, hotter part of the desert, for example, Phoenix, which is actually more down this way, the places that were lower elevation, Vegas, don't have as much food. The places that are higher elevation, as you get into the edge of the Rocky Mountains and up into the Sierra Nevada, that's often way too cold in the winter, and not as much grows up there. You could, of course, you wouldn't be able to grow any crops or anything. So in the Great Basin, 5,000 to 7,000 feet are where most people lived. And if they could find a place to live along a river or a creek, they would, or a lake. Not so much the Salt Lake, because you can't drink that water, but you could drink the water that was coming to it from different tributaries. The thinking about living near water, well, there's animals that come to the water. You can use it to grow a few simple kinds of crops. They were not pretty much into horticulture, and there are plants that will grow that you can take and use for food. For example, acorns and piñons. Piñon seeds are from pine trees. So they're a kind of pine tree that doesn't really grow that tall. And there are a lot of them all through here and other places of, generally speaking, 4,000 or 5,000 feet, 6,000 feet, there'll be some piñon trees if there's enough water. And you can collect the pine cones and knock these little tiny seeds out, roast them, crack them open, and eat them. So that's what people used to do. I'm going to show you a couple of pictures now. So you might have seen places. This is like a very nice looking place with all of the red rock and so on. You might have seen these places if you've driven through Utah and Nevada. Very dry, not much for a buffalo to eat. Okay, so there were not very many buffalo kind of critters in places like this. There are rabbits, lots of rabbits. Eventually, some horses moved from the Spanish bringing horses into the, well, actually far to the south. They ended up moving up to the Plains Indians who were over further east, but some of them would trade with the Plateau Indians, Native Americans, and after a while there were some horses available, but they, of course, were not native to the place, and people were relying on rabbits, lots of rabbits. And in fact, they could eat the rabbit and make the rabbit skins into clothes. And your book will tell you a funny thing. What the native people used to do is put their rabbit skin coats on top of anthills because lice and other critters would get into this rabbit fur, and the ants would eat and kill all of those little insects you don't really want in your clothes. Because it's so dry, there might be an area, for example, over here at the base of the hill that might have a spring, and you want to travel, you have to carry your water, and you're walking when you're traveling. So you might be traveling for a couple of hours, couple of days of carrying gallons of water. And if you tried to carry it in a bit of pottery, well, it would be way too heavy. So what the people had to do instead is carry it in baskets. And sometimes they would, if something was heavy, they would catch it or, put it in a hidden place to be safe while they went from one place to another. And when they were going from one place to another, mostly what they were carrying is water, and then some clothes and a few other tools and maybe some hunting supplies, that kind of thing. But it was very difficult, and you might walk 2 days all day long and maybe get 30 or 40 miles to another place where hopefully that you knew there was water. So it was a very, very difficult kind of place to live. And in an area as big as Santa Rosa, if that was in this desert region here, you might only have 4 or 5 people, because that's all that you could support, the amount of seeds that you could find, the amount of rabbits that you could find, and that kind of thing. Let's go back to our study guide. Talks about styles of leadership. So generally what happened as far as being a leader is that there were small groups of people, a family, an extended family, maybe even a couple families together. And the oldest people in the family were generally very well respected. And for these plateau uh, basin Indians, generally it was the male, one of the older men, grandpa, who would be kind of the leader and would talk to other tribes or other groups, set out the views of his group, try to get everybody to agree. But the leaders there didn't really have the kind of authority where I am the leader, you're going to do what I say, but rather try to convince everybody through influence what the best approach would be or what we should be doing next. So that was the kind of leadership that we had and still have in those groups. As far as disease and slaves go, sadly, it's an old story of people who excuse me, who get sick. I'm coughing while I'm telling you about that. Mostly, we think because of the Europeans and the Americans inadvertently bringing in different kinds of diseases. And sadly, huge number of people here died when they did encounter the Spanish and later the Americans from these diseases. And missionaries and gold rush seekers, lots of people going through this region. Because as you can imagine, it's on the way. So you're over here, you hear about gold, you hear about the Oregon Trail, you hear about California, and you are walking or going in a wagon train all the way across the country, and you crossing through this plateau region and the Great Basin region, which is the one we're working on this week, but right through the middle of it, and you're carrying disease. So unfortunately, a lot of people did die, 80, 90% of the people. And we still don't have the number of indigenous Native Americans in this region that we think were there before the first contact. Partially because there aren't very many jobs and people have gone to cities to work, but also just because it was so devastating as far as the population dropping in size so much. The study guide also mentions slaves, and you'll read about this in your book, but unfortunately, again, people did capture other people to be slaves. The Indians had slaves that they would be from other tribes, but then even worse, there was this possibly worse, I don't know, if you're a slave, no matter what, it's bad, but possibly worse, people were captured by one tribe and then, or by the Europeans. Both kinds of things happened. Then they were sent south to Santa Fe, places like that, where they were sold in the 1830s as slaves, and then would go to slave states, excuse me, or to Mexico. So it was pretty bad. And both sides, if you want to view it as a side kind of thing, the European Americans and the Native Americans had slaves, because at that time in the world, slavery had been around for thousands of years. It was very common. So that's kind of a sad thing. And I'm going to let you read on your own about the ghost dance. It was very, very important, but I want you to kind of, as you're reading about it, think, was it dangerous to the American settlers or not? And did the American soldiers and state authorities overreact or not? So be thinking about that. And then when you get to looking about the contemporary Native Americans, think about, well, are people still living on the reservations? How did the reservations come about? Because there weren't any reservations before contact. And what's the unemployment like, and what kind of enterprises are the tribes doing? So be looking for that as you read that last chapter. So I'm going to go back to our photographs now, and I'm going to tell you a little story about Coyote. So this is a Native American story, and I think it's kind of fun every once in a while to have one rather than just tell you these facts. Coyote, back in the olden days, was not just a dog-like creature. He was a magical figure that had powers, sort of was known for trying to trick other creatures, other animals. And at the time when this story occurred, there weren't any people. There were just other animals. And the animals in this sort of magical world had spirits, and they were kind of like people, but they weren't people and they weren't animals. There's something in between. So what happened is that Coyote was wandering around, and he had different animal friends, and he looked to see, where are my bird friends? Where's my rabbit friends? Any antelope out there? Of course, no horses. Couldn't find any friends. I was getting kind of frustrated. So he plunked himself down, sitting, and underneath him he could hear this, like, what's that? And he realized he had sat on a meadowlark and broke its little leg. And the meadowlark said, get off me, get off me. So Coyote got up and he said, oh, sorry. The meadowlark said, you've broken my leg. And then Coyote said, I will fix your leg with a stick if you can tell me what happened to all of my friends. Where are all the animals and the other birds? And the meadowlark said, oh, there's a gigantic, this big of a monster that ate them all. So Coyote thought, well, that's no good. I won't have any friends at all, except this bird was kind of mad at me for sitting on his leg. So he fixed the bird up, collected his fire-making tools and his hunting tools, and started walking over to where this huge monster was sleeping sort of half awake on its belly. and went up to the monster's head and said, "Monster, can you let me in? I want to see my friends." And the monster had heard that Coyote was sort of a tricky animal, and he knew it would not be good to get tricked by this coyote. So he said, "No, you cannot come inside of me." And Coyote is like, well, what can I do? So he started thinking for a while, and then he started moping and looking really sad and kind of making whining noises. And finally, the monster said, "What?" And he said, "I just miss my friends so much. I would just be so much happier if I could be with my friends. I don't even care if you eat me up." So the monster said, "Okay." So he opened his mouth really big, and Coyote went in and down, down, down his throat, all the way down into the middle of this monster. And he could see his friends were there. And he said, I'm going to get us all out of here. And all the different animals were complimenting him for being so wise and wonderful. But then, Fox said, "Well, how in the heck are you going to do this?" And he said, "Well, let's start a little fire." So he started a fire in there. They could see better, and then got out his knives, and they all started chopping at the heart of the monster. And the monster realized he had been tricked, and he let out great groans, "Oh, no, no," and then died. And then the animals and Coyote cut their way out, and they took pieces of the heart, and Coyote flung one piece way over here, and another piece way over here, another piece way over here, and another piece way over here. And each of the places he threw a bit of the monster's heart turned into a different tribe. And finally, there were tribes that were spread out throughout the whole basin, but there weren't any right there. There was just a little bit of blood left and some bits of the monster. And the fox then said, "Well, you did a great job, but you're going to be lonely because now you've got these native peoples that are starting all these other places, all these Indians, but none here." So Coyote said, "You're right." And he took some of the blood from the monster and he shook it, shook it, shook it on the ground. And that turned into the Nez Perce Indian tribe. And the animals and the native peoples all lived happily ever after. All right. So I hope you like that little story, which I didn't write, but I am happy to have read about it and to share that with you. And you're now ready to move on as far as reading your chapter, taking good notes, and then watching this film, which is quite interesting, about the Shoshone who lived in this area of the basin. Okay, that's all for this week. Thanks for coming.